There is a thing I never told anyone at the hearing. Because there was no hearing. Because by the end, there was no one left to hold one. I saw it first in Tesla Kostovsky's hands. This was the Tuesday before the whole base went quiet, and Tesla was bent over the calibration panel on the 4th floor of the radar tower, and his right hand would not stop shaking. It was not the shake of a man who had drunk too much coffee, or not enough. It was a tremor that lived half an inch under the skin, small and private, and it traveled up his wrist and ran out somewhere in the long muscles of his forearm. I noticed because I was standing in the doorway waiting to sign the log. That was my job that week, or part of it. I was a security specialist, 3rd class, United States Air Force, 24 years old. A boy from Green Bay who had enlisted mostly because my father had, and mostly because I did not know what else to do with myself. At Torrent Lake Air Force Station, a listening post sunk into the pines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, one of my duties was to walk the tower, watch the doors, and witness the signatures on the equipment logs. Tesla signed. His pen wandered. The last letter of his name trailed off the line like something falling out of a boat. I stood there. I watched him. I thought, he's sick. I thought, I should mention it. Protocol. The kind of protocol that lived inside a binder on a shelf no one opened, said that any personnel operating primary sensor equipment who showed signs of impairment must be reported to the duty officer without delay. I knew the page by heart. I had underlined parts of it during indoc. I did not mention it. I told myself Tesla had a cold. I told myself it was none of my business. I told myself the duty officer that night was Lieutenant Albrecht, and Albrecht did not take kindly to airmen sticking their noses into the technical side. And I told myself a dozen other things that were all ways of saying I didn't want to do it. I signed my own name under Tesla's trailing one. I walked down the stairs. I went to the mess hall and ate a plate of powdered eggs. That is my confession. I did not pull the trigger on what came next. I just declined to be the man who might have slowed it down. I have had 11 years to think about what difference it would have made. Maybe none. Maybe the thing was already loose, had been loose for weeks, was moving through the base like a rumor no one had bothered to say aloud. But that is an argument I lose every time I have it with myself. Because the only honest answer is that I don't know, and not knowing is its own kind of weight. I am going to tell it the way I remember it. I was there. I got out. Most of them did not. Torrent Lake sat on a shoulder of land 40-some miles south of the Canadian border, and roughly the same distance from the nearest town worth calling a town. The Air Force had picked the spot in the early 50s for the simple reason that the land rose there. Not much, but enough, and the pines did not crowd the ridge, and the lake to the north gave a clean sweep of air for the antennas. It was what we called an AC&W site, aircraft control and warning, part of a thin chain of stations that watched the northern sky for whatever the Soviets might send across the pole. Our FPS-27 search radar made a slow, full turn every 10 seconds. Our FPS-6 height finder nodded up and down like a machine remembering something. In the operations building, at consoles hooked into Sage by leased teletype line, operators in blue fatigues stared at scopes and wrote the traces of commercial airliners, military flights, weather patterns, and, very occasionally, things that made everyone in the room sit up a little straighter. Those got reported up the line to Duluth. Duluth decided whether to care. There were about 80 of us on station in the late spring of 1970. A captain in command, 2 lieutenants under him, a master sergeant who actually ran the place, and the rest of us sprinkled between the tower, the ops building, the motor pool, the chow hall, the dispensary, and the squat brick barracks. We had a chaplain who flew in once a month, a flight surgeon who covered 3 stations and was seldom at any of them, and a civilian contractor named Elvin Paquette who maintained the generators and knew more about our electrical system than anyone wearing a uniform. The base's purpose was simple, and, by the summer of 1970, quietly outdated. We watched for bombers that, by then, had mostly been replaced in everyone's nightmares by missiles. Missiles did not obey our radar the way bombers did. They came in too high and too fast, and by the time you saw them, you were not going to make a call to Duluth. You were going to make your peace. But the station had been built, and the appropriations kept coming, and so we watched. Torrent Lake was the kind of posting you got if someone above you wanted you somewhere you could not cause trouble, or the kind you requested if you did not want anyone to ask you questions. It had a little of both flavors. I did not mind it. There was a decency to the routine. You woke, you ate, you walked your post, you watched the weather. You played cards with the same 4 men who played cards every night, and you slept. On weekends in the warm months, you could take a jeep out to the lake and fish pike through the reeds if an officer signed off on it. In the winter, you could not do anything but read and wait for the plow. There was a kind of honesty in the boredom. It did not lie to you about what it was. The men I worked closest with were Staff Sergeant Ames Dumfries, my NCO, a career man from Kentucky who had done a tour in Korea and another on Guam, and who treated every day at Torrent Lake like a vacation he did not entirely trust. Corporal Waldo Prue, a French-Canadian kid out of the Keweenaw who had grown up in a mining town 20 miles from our gate and had joined up mostly to get away from his father. And Airman Horner, who was not yet 20 and who laughed at everything, because everything at 20 is still funny. Waldo and I shared a bay in the barracks. He snored. I kicked his bunk. He would kick it back, and we would both go back to sleep. That was as close to a conversation as some nights got, and I remember it with a gratitude I could not have named then. Tesla Kostovsky was not in our circle exactly. He was a radar maintenance specialist, a technical sort, quiet and precise, Ukrainian by way of Cleveland. He spoke carefully, as if he were translating himself out of another language even when he wasn't. He played chess with Elvin Paquette in the day room on Sundays, and he wrote long letters to someone whose name I never learned. He was, by any measure I had, a good airman. Which is why, when I saw his hand shake, I told myself it was nothing. Good airmen did not have problems. That was the kind of reasoning I was 24 years old and using. The Wednesday after the log, Tesla did not show up for the morning shift. This was not, in itself, alarming. People missed muster for a dozen reasons, most of them small. Staff Sergeant Dumfries sent Horner over to the barracks to fetch him. Horner came back and said Tesla was not in his bunk. His bunk was made. His locker was open. His field jacket was gone. His boots were on the floor. "Boots on the floor?" Dumfries said. He looked up from his clipboard. "Yes, Sergeant." "And his jacket is missing." "Yes, Sergeant." Dumfries stood there for a full count of 3. I could see him running the arithmetic. A man does not leave his boots and take his jacket. A man does not make his bunk and then vanish from it. Not unless someone above him has told him to, and no one above Tesla had told him to, because if they had, Dumfries would have been the one to carry the order. He sent me with Horner to check the tower. The tower was empty. The calibration log from the night before had Tesla signing in at 2200 and never signing out. The technical duty officer, a young lieutenant named Korzeniowski, who wanted very much to be taken seriously and was not, had apparently gone home at midnight and left Tesla working. The log said as much. Tesla's last entry was a notation on the number 2 height finder. Anomaly at bearing 318, range 40, non-returning. Assessed as atmospheric. Noted. And that was it. I showed Dumfries the log. He read it twice. He went to the captain. The captain's name was Niedermeyer. He was a square-faced man from Wisconsin, which I had always taken as a kind of private luck for me, a fellow Cheese State man watching over my career. He read the log. He asked if we had searched the grounds. We had not. He ordered a sweep of the perimeter. The base was not large. A pair of two-man teams could walk its outer fence in under an hour. We walked it. We found nothing on the fence. On the way back, though, passing the generator shed, Horner stopped and pointed. There was a smear on the door. It was the size of a palm. It was dark. It was dry. It was not rust. Paquette came out of the shed wiping his hands on a rag, heard us explaining, and looked at the smear without expression for a long moment. Then he said, "Huh," which was the most I had ever heard him say about anything that was not a diesel engine. He opened the door. Inside, the shed was tidy, which was Paquette's work. The generators hummed along their rotation. There was nothing else there. But the rag in Paquette's hand, I noticed, had been a different color before he started wiping. We did not find Tesla. We reported the smear. The flight surgeon was not on station, and the dispensary was manned that week by Nurse Frida Oster, a civilian contracted through some arrangement I never understood, a small, gray-haired woman from Grand Rapids who had worked in a county hospital for 30 years before she came north. She looked at the door. She did not touch it. She said, in a voice I remember better now than I did then, "I would like everyone who entered that shed in the last 24 hours to come see me. Please." Nobody took her seriously. Nobody went. Except Paquette, who did, because Paquette was that kind of man. He walked down to the dispensary that afternoon on his own feet. I saw him walk back 2 hours later, and I thought he looked tired. That was all I thought. Thursday was when Gilroy, a cook in the mess, cut a man's ear with a bread knife during the lunch-serving line. That was the sentence that traveled around the base by the afternoon. It made Gilroy sound like he had lost his temper, which was not what had happened at all. But it was a sentence the base could handle, so the base used it. What had actually happened was this. Gilroy had been working the pass for 20 minutes when he began to sway. An airman named Pavlo Brennick, who was eating, saw him sway and called out, "Hey, Gilroy, you all right?" And Gilroy did not answer. Gilroy walked out from behind the line, crossed the dining hall, put his hand on Brennick's shoulder, and bit the left side of Brennick's head. He bit the cartilage and did not let go. It took 3 men to pull him off. In the struggle, someone got a bread knife from the pass and got it between Gilroy's jaw and Brennick's head and cut a piece of Brennick's ear. Then Gilroy fell back, and his eyes were wrong, and he did not answer when anyone said his name, and they put him in the dispensary on Frida Oster's table, and she locked the door. I heard the story 3 times by the end of the day, and by the 3rd time it had already begun to soften. Gilroy cracked. Gilroy has been under a lot of pressure. Gilroy's wife wrote him a letter. The story was folding itself up into a manageable shape. This is what men do, I have learned. Men take a shape they cannot hold and fold it until they can put it in a pocket. That night, Captain Niedermeyer called an all-hands briefing in the day room. He stood under the fluorescent tubes and told us that Staff Sergeant Gilroy had been restrained pending medical evaluation. He said the Air Force took the welfare of its personnel seriously. He said he had been in contact with Duluth. He said a medical team would fly in on Saturday, weather permitting. He said there would be no further disruption to operations. Someone from the back of the room asked about Tesla Kostovsky. Niedermeyer said the Air Force was investigating. He did not say what. After the briefing, Dumfries pulled me aside. He said, "Tony, I want you on the night walk with Prue, full kit." "Yes, Sergeant." He looked at me for a beat longer than he usually did. Dumfries was not a man who explained himself. But he was a man who looked at you sometimes as if he were trying to decide whether you could handle what he was about to not explain. He did not decide I could. He just said, "Be careful." Waldo and I walked the perimeter that night. We had our M16s, which were still a novelty to me then, having trained on M14s. We had our flashlights. We had the small, foolish talismans any young man carries on a post. Lucky coins and photographs, and in Waldo's case, a St. Christopher medal his mother had pressed into his hand at the Greyhound station. The pines were very still. There was no wind. A lake country night can be so quiet that you can hear your own blood moving. And I heard mine. We walked the east fence. We walked the north. At the northwest corner, where the perimeter ran closest to the tree line, Waldo stopped, held up his hand, and said, without looking at me, "Tony, listen." I listened. It was a soft sound. It was almost a breathing, but not quite. It was several somethings breathing at an interval that was not human. A kind of unsynchronized panting that seemed to come from 6 or 8 different places inside the trees. We did not shine the lights. I don't know why. Something stopped us both. We stood there for a long time with our rifles at low ready, and the breathing continued, and we walked, very slowly, back the way we had come. We did not run. We did not look back. We reported what we had heard. Dumfries wrote it down. He did not ask us for details. He did not look surprised. He said, "Write it up. Go sleep. We're on alert at 0500. Friday morning the base was sealed. Niedermeyer announced it at muster. DEFCON level language I had not heard used outside of drill. All personnel to remain on station. All outbound communications routed through the captain's office. The gate closed and sandbagged. The antenna farm perimeter patrolled in pairs. No reason given. Rumors moved fast in a place like Torrent Lake. By noon it was understood by everyone that Tesla Kostovsky had been found, though no one had seen him. By 1400, it was understood that Gilroy had been moved from the dispensary to the supply basement, though no one had seen that either. By 1600, Elvin Paquette had not reported to his afternoon shift at the generator shed, and the civilian maintenance man who was supposed to be covering his work was sent over by Dumfries and came back with the news that Paquette was in his quarters and would not open the door. Dumfries went himself. I went with him because Dumfries pointed at me on his way past. Paquette lived in a single room at the back of the maintenance building, a small spare space with a cot, a pressed wood desk, and a bookshelf that held paperback westerns. Dumfries knocked. No answer. He knocked again and identified himself. From inside, a voice I would have sworn was not Paquette's said, "I'm fine, Sergeant, I'm just tired." "Open the door, Elvin." "I'm tired, Sergeant, please. I'll open it tomorrow." Dumfries looked at me. His face had done something I had not seen it do before. It had gone flat, the way water goes flat before it freezes. "Tomorrow, Elvin." "Yes, Sergeant." We walked away. When we were clear of the building, Dumfries stopped and said, softly, so only I could hear, "Tony, I want you to find Corporal Prue and tell him to pack a field kit. Both of you. Quietly. No one else. Then I want you to go to the motor pool and check the fuel and the batteries on the Deuce and a Half, the one with the canvas. Quietly. Do not tell the pool sergeant why. You are just doing a routine mechanical inspection. If anyone asks you, the pool sergeant already approved it." "Sergeant, is that—" "Do not finish that sentence, Airman." I did not finish it. I found Waldo. I told him what Dumfries had said. Waldo listened without speaking, which was not like him, and when I was done, he nodded once, very slowly, and said, "My grandmother used to talk about the influenza of 1918. The way people came back from it, you know? People who did not, really, come back." "What are you saying, Waldo?" "I am saying nothing, Tony. I am packing a kit." We packed. We went to the motor pool. I ran the checks on the deuce. The fuel was 3/4. The batteries turned over on the first try. I noted it on a clipboard I pretended to be holding for a reason. The pool sergeant, a morose man named Torrent, did not look up. That was Friday afternoon. By Friday evening, the gate guard at the east vehicle entrance, a kid named Ricky Dewhurst, was no longer answering his radio. The first time I fired my rifle with live rounds at another human being was at about 2200 hours that Friday, in the motor pool, at a shape that had been Staff Sergeant Gilroy. I am going to tell it plainly because I cannot tell it any other way. Gilroy had gotten out of the supply basement. I do not know how. The supply basement was locked from the outside, was accessed by a steel door, had a padlock on that door. And yet, Gilroy was in the motor pool, and Gilroy was moving between the vehicles, and Gilroy was not making any sound at all. And when he saw me, he did not run at me, not at first. He stopped. He tilted his head. He looked at me the way a dog looks at something it is trying to remember. I was alone. Waldo was on the other side of the lot, checking the second deuce. I had my rifle at low ready. I had been trained for this. I had been trained, I should say, for something like this, for a hostile who was not yet a hostile, a situation not yet escalated. I said, "Sergeant Gilroy, identify yourself." Gilroy, who had taught me how to use a dough hook once in the mess hall during a voluntary kitchen detail, who had given me an extra slice of pie on my 23rd birthday because he had heard someone mention it, came across the lot at me in a walk that was half lurch and half shamble. His eyes were empty. His mouth was open. His chin was black with something I did not want to think about. I said his name again. He did not stop. I raised the rifle. I fired. I was trained to fire center mass. I fired 3 rounds. They hit. Gilroy took them the way a post takes a hammer. He kept coming. I shifted my aim and fired twice more, higher. The second round took him in the face, and he fell. I stood over him. He was not breathing. Or he was, once, a slow rattle, and then he was not. I threw up. Waldo had come running. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, Tony, we have to go get Dumfries." We did not get Dumfries. Dumfries came running, drawn by the shots, and he looked at Gilroy's body, and he said, "Christ." And he looked at me, and he said, "Good, Tony. Good shot. Head. Remember that. Head." "Sergeant, what?" "Get the truck started. Get Prue in. Wait for me." He ran for the captain's office. That was the last time I saw Ames Dumfries. I do not know what happened to him. I know that somewhere between the motor pool and the captain's office, the base came apart in earnest. Because while Waldo and I sat in the cab of that deuce-and-a-half with the engine idling, we heard rifle fire from the direction of the barracks, and then rifle fire from the direction of the tower, and then a long stretch of silence worse than the fire, and then the base's siren started up and ran for maybe 10 seconds and cut off, the way a throat cuts off. Waldo was praying under his breath in French. I was not praying. I was staring at the gate. The gate was closed. I said, "Waldo, the gate." Waldo said, "Someone has to open it." I said, "Dumfries told us to wait." Waldo said, "Tony, look." I looked. Behind us, past the maintenance building, past the dark bulk of the mess hall, past the faint yellow rectangles of the barracks windows, figures were moving. They were moving in and out of doorways. They were moving without hurry. They were moving without sound. There were more of them every time I blinked, as if the night were producing them the way the ground produces mist. I said, "Get down. I'm going to run it." I put the truck in gear. I drove across the lot to the gate. I got out, keeping the engine running, and I cut the chain with the bolt cutters we had stowed in the cab, and I swung the gate open. Something moved at the edge of my vision, something in the trees beyond the fence, and I did not look. I got back in the cab, I put the truck in gear, I drove through. I did not close the gate behind me. I have thought about that often over the years. I left the base's east vehicle gate open that night. I do not know what difference it made. The base was already finished, but I left it open. The road that ran south from Torrent Lake was a County 2 lane that ran for 11 miles through pine plantation and cut over scrub before it met the east-west state highway. It was not patrolled. The base's commute had always been light, a few contractors and the weekly courier and the monthly supply run. That night I expected the road to be empty, and it was, at first. Waldo sat in the cab beside me, with his rifle between his knees, the muzzle pointing at the floor. He had my field jacket over his shoulders because his was still in his locker and there had been no time. The deuce made a steady mechanical noise that seemed, in the darkness, very loud and very lonely. We did not talk for the first few miles. Then Waldo said, "We should have tried for Dumfries." He told us to wait. We did wait. Not long enough. Long enough. He said that with an evenness I could hear him working to maintain. I did not respond. I was watching the road. In the headlights, the yellow reflectors of the mile markers came up one after another, each one a small, bright eye opening and closing. At the 6th mile marker, I saw a car on the shoulder. A civilian sedan, older model, driver's door open, interior light on. I slowed. The interior was empty. There was a purse on the passenger seat. There was a shoe in the footwell. I did not stop. I do not know if I should have. We went past. At the state highway, I stopped the truck under the dead traffic signal and sat with my hands on the wheel and thought. The cabin my uncle had left me was another 50-some miles to the southwest, in a pocket of national forest land near a small private lake with no road of its own, accessible by a 2-track that branched off a Forest Service road, that branched off a county road, that branched off this highway. My uncle Orrin Haugen had bought the parcel in 1958 and built on it through the early 60s, mostly with his own hands, and he had left it to me when he died, on the straightforward reasoning that my father did not fish, and I did. The shelter under it was a separate story, one I will come to. For now, I will say only that my uncle had been a man with a long memory for bad things, and a long forearm for concrete work, and a habit of preparing for outcomes that most men found it more comfortable to ignore. He had been right, in the end, about more than he should have been. We went southwest. 40 miles in, we passed a town. It was not a town I had been to. It was a lake town, the kind with a single gas station and a bar and a general store and maybe 300 permanent residents. We came around a bend and it was in front of us, and the power was out. No streetlights, no store signs. A single amber flicker from the window of the bar, which I took, as we passed, for a candle or a lantern. In front of the general store, a body lay in the middle of the road. I did not look long enough to see what kind of body. Waldo said, "Don't stop," and I did not stop. On the far side of town, standing just past the welcome sign, was a woman. She was barefoot. She was wearing a white nightgown. She was standing very straight, and her arms were at her sides, and as we passed her, she turned her head to track us. She did not run at the truck. She did not wave at us. She turned her head and watched us go by, and I saw her face in the side mirror for a long moment, and I saw that her mouth was open and her jaw was moving, and no sound was coming out. Waldo put his hand over his St. Christopher medal. I kept driving. We drove for another hour. The road turned to gravel and then to the red dirt two-track I remembered from summers, narrower and more overgrown than I had left it in my memory. The truck scraped branches on both sides. I cut the headlights at the last turn and used only the parking lamps, because I could not say why, except that I was beginning to think that light was a thing to be careful with. At the last bend, where the track opened into a small clearing, I stopped the truck and we sat in the dark and listened. We heard nothing. An owl somewhere. A branch ticking against another branch. A lake water sound from beyond the cabin, because the little lake was 20 paces past the porch. The cabin was where my uncle had left it. It was not much to look at. Squared logs, a green tin roof, a single chimney, a small porch. A woodshed off to one side, weathered board and batten. A privy behind. A hand pump beside the porch. That was all of it above the ground. The key was under a flat stone my uncle had placed 40 years before against the third foundation log, and it was still there. The door still fit its jamb. The interior still smelled of cedar and cold ash and the faint mineral of the pump water that had seeped into every cup in the cupboard. Waldo stood in the door with his rifle and his eyes very wide and said, "Tony, this is yours?" It was my uncle's. Your uncle was a rich man. My uncle was a careful man. I lit the kerosene lamp on the table. I went around the room touching things, the way you touch things when you need to prove to yourself that you are in a real place and not a dream. The wood stove, the rocking chair with the split cane seat, the bookshelf with my uncle's books, his Zane Greys and his Louis L'Amours, and his 2 volumes of Gibbon. A framed photograph of my uncle in his army uniform from 1944, cheekbones like a blade, eyes that even in black and white looked like they had seen things. I said, "Waldo, stay in the cabin. Do not come out until I call for you. I want to check the shed." "Why the shed?" "Because my uncle built something under it." He looked at me, for a moment, the way a man looks at another man he has just learned has been carrying a second self. "Tony, what exactly does your uncle's shed have under it?" "You will see. Stay here." Uncle Orrin had served in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945, had come home with a limp and 2 medals he never displayed, and had refused for the rest of his life to take any job that required him to ask another man's permission. He had worked as a trapper, briefly. He had worked for the Forest Service, briefly. He had finally settled into a kind of independent handyman's life out of a small shop in Marquette. And he had bought the cabin parcel when he was 45 years old, with money he had saved $1 at a time. He had built the shelter over 4 summers, starting in 1960. I had been a boy then, 8 or 9, and I had spent 2 of those summers with him. I had helped him mix concrete in a wheelbarrow with a hoe. I had helped him set rebar. I had helped him carry blocks. He had not told me what we were building. He had said, "We are building a cellar," and I had believed him, because I was a child. It was not a cellar. Or it was a cellar the way a rifle is a hunting tool. Under the woodshed, set into concrete that my uncle had poured with the help of one neighbor he trusted and no one else, was a steel hatch. The hatch was covered in normal times by a scatter of split firewood and a false plank floor my uncle had fitted over it. I moved the wood, lifted the plank floor, and there it was. The handle was a recessed ring. The lock was a combination dial my uncle had shown me once and made me memorize. And I had, the way a child memorizes things he does not yet know he will need. The combination was my grandmother's birthday. The hatch opened with a low, clean sound. A ladder went down into dark. Cool air rose up out of it, faintly metallic, carrying the thin scent of old canned food and the mineral smell of well water. I went down. I lit the lamp at the bottom of the ladder. I saw what my uncle had built. It was not large. It was perhaps 14 feet by 20, a concrete box set 8 feet into the ground. The walls were poured concrete, 8 inches thick, reinforced. The ceiling was the same. There was a bunk along one wall, a small table, a chair, a chemical toilet behind a curtain, and, along the opposite wall, floor-to-ceiling wooden shelves. The shelves held, in neat rows, cans of peaches, pears, green beans, corn, Spam, corned beef hash, evaporated milk, bags of rice and dry beans in sealed metal canisters, matches in a coffee can, candles, a kerosene lantern and a can of fuel, a small cast-iron stove with a flue that vented up through a concealed pipe that ran, I would later find, into the back of the cabin's main chimney, so that any smoke the shelter produced would come out of the cabin's chimney and look like an ordinary cabin's fire. A 5-gallon jug of water, a hand-crank radio, an old bolt-action 30-30, a box of ammunition, a first aid kit, a stack of paperback books, a deck of cards, a journal. A journal. I sat down on the bunk with my uncle's journal in my hands, and I read the first page by the lamp. The handwriting was his, the same handwriting that had taught me how to write my own name. The first entry was dated September 1962. It said, "Finished the air intake today. Ran it up through the chimney. The filter is a double of the filter I used on the bunker in Leyte. It will do. The shelter is complete. I hope to God I never need it. I hope to God no one I love ever needs it. If you are reading this, it is because I was right and I did not want to be. I sat there on my uncle's bunk and I put my face in my hands and I cried for a while, quietly, the way a man cries when he has understood something he should have understood earlier. Then I called up the ladder for Waldo and I showed him what my uncle had left for us. We settled in over the next 3 days. Some of this is a blur to me now. There was the work of moving what we could carry from the 2.5 into the cabin and down into the shelter. There was the work of hiding the truck, which we did by driving it a 1/4 mile back along the 2-track and pulling it in under a stand of balsam and covering the cab with pine boughs. There was the work of clearing snow from the woodshed, even though it was May, because snow still lay in patches under the roof's north eave. There was the work of running a wire from the battery of our rifle's spare power source to a small 12-volt bulb my uncle had installed in the shelter, so that we could have a dim yellow light without burning through his candles. And there was the radio. On the second night, I brought up the hand-crank radio, cranked it, and turned the dial through static until I found a voice. The voice was a man's, thin and tired, on what he said was a civilian emergency frequency being used by whoever could keep a transmitter running. He was broadcasting out of a television station in Green Bay, which caught my breath for a second, because Green Bay was my home. He said the National Guard had withdrawn from 3 cities in Wisconsin and was regrouping at Camp Douglas. He said the outbreak was widespread, but not universal. He said the Upper Peninsula was cut off because the 2 bridges had been ordered closed by the governor of Michigan on Friday night, and one of them had then been destroyed on Saturday by persons unknown. He said that if you were hearing this in a remote area, you should stay in that area. He said that help would come eventually. He said he was going to keep broadcasting as long as he had power and as long as he was alive. He said, "God bless you, wherever you are." Then he read a list of names. They were names of people who had been confirmed alive and were asking to be found by anyone who might be listening. 40 or 50 names, maybe. I listened to every one. I did not recognize any of them. Then he signed off and played a recording of the Star-Spangled Banner, and the recording ended, and the station went to static. Waldo listened with me. When the anthem stopped playing, he said quietly, "My mother is in Painsdale. If she's listening to that, she will be fine. She can hunt. She has my Uncle Remy's rifle." I said, "I believe it." He said, "Do you?" I said, "I do, Waldo." I don't know if I did, but he needed to hear it said. On the morning of the 4th day, Waldo went down to the lake to fill the water jug. He did not come back for almost an hour. I was beginning to think about whether to go after him when the cabin door opened and he came in, slow, white-faced, carrying the jug in his left hand. His right hand was pressed against his left forearm. I said, "Waldo." He said, "Tony, please do not do anything stupid." He sat down at the table. He put the jug on the floor. He lifted his right hand off his left forearm. There were 2 puncture wounds there, the kind left by teeth, and the skin around them was already red. I said, "Who?" He said, "I don't know. It was a man. He came out of the water, Tony. He was crouched down under the lily pads, I think. I don't know. I didn't see him. He came up out of the water, and he had me before I knew he was there. I hit him with the jug. He went back under." Went back under? He didn't come up again. I think I broke his skull. I think. I sat down across from him. I looked at the wounds on his arm. They were not large. They were not deep. They were, in every way, unremarkable, except for what I knew about them and what he knew about them. I said, "Waldo, listen to me. Maybe not everyone." He said, "Tony." I said, "Maybe not everyone who gets bitten. We don't know. The radio said widespread, not universal. Maybe some people." He said, "Tony, we do know." And I knew he was right. I had seen Gilroy. I had seen the woman in the white nightgown. I had seen the reports of Tesla. I had seen the smear on the generator shed door. I had in me by then enough evidence to draw the line honestly, and I was trying not to draw it. And Waldo, who was a better man than I was about most things, was refusing to let me lie to him. He said, "You need to decide, Tony, before I cannot." This was the decision my uncle had not left me instructions for. His journal had told me how to ration the water. It had told me how to vent the stove. It had told me to check the filter on the air intake every 6 weeks and how to clean it. It had not told me what to do when the man who had come with me into the shelter had been bitten in the lake. I said, "I am not going to shoot you, Waldo." He said, "I am not asking you to shoot me." He got up from the table. He walked to the shelves. He took down the bolt-action 30-30. He loaded it from the box of ammunition. He said, "You are going to walk me to the lake. You are going to stay 30 paces behind me. You are going to not look when it is time. You are going to come back, and you are going to live." I said, "Waldo." He said, "Tony, I have a mother in Painsdale. Listen to me. If she is alive, someone is going to have to tell her that her son did not turn into that. That is the only piece of this you can carry for me." I said, "Waldo, please." He said, "It is not a request, Tony." I walked him to the lake. I stayed 30 paces behind. He did not look back. He stopped at the edge of the water, where the morning light made the flat surface look like a sheet of hammered tin. He stood there for a minute. He crossed himself with his right hand. He took the St. Christopher medal off his neck and wrapped the chain around his left wrist and clenched his fist over it, so that whoever found him, if anyone did, would know where to send it. I did not look when it was time. I heard it. I walked back to the cabin. I sat on the porch. I waited until the shaking in my hands stopped. I wrote the address of Waldo's mother's house in Painesdale on the inside cover of my uncle's journal in case I forgot it later, which I would not have, but I did not trust my mind in that hour. Then I went down into the shelter and I shut the hatch. I did not come up for 2 days. I am going to tell the rest more briefly. I stayed at the cabin for the rest of that spring, through the summer, and into the fall. I did not meet another person in that time. I heard them on the radio. The man in Green Bay went off the air sometime in June, I think. A woman came on in his place for a few weeks, broadcasting out of what she said was the basement of a hospital in Eau Claire, and then she went silent too. Other voices came and went on other frequencies. I heard the Canadians, sometimes, on a station out of Thunder Bay. I heard the Army Corps of Engineers at Sault Ste. Marie, briefly, in July, broadcasting that the locks had been secured and that they were accepting civilian refugees at a perimeter they had established around the city. I considered, for a day, walking to the Sioux. I did not. I did not know if the broadcast was current. I did not know if the road would hold me. I did not know what I would do when I got there, or whether whoever was running the perimeter would let me in, or whether they would ask me what had happened at Torrent Lake and what I would say if they did. I stayed. I learned things I had not known I would have to learn. I learned to clean a 30-30. I learned to trap rabbits. I learned to identify the plants my uncle had pressed into the back of his journal, the ones that would feed me and the ones that would kill me. I learned to sit very still for long periods of time and to hear, in the stillness, what my own mind sounded like when nothing else was in the room with it. That was the hardest thing I learned. A man, by himself, for a long time, is a strange country. The infected came close to the cabin only twice that summer. The first time was in July. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, walking out of the trees along the lakeshore in the slow, unsynchronized way I had first heard at the Torrent Lake fence. I was on the porch. They did not see me because I did not move. I watched them come to the edge of the clearing. I watched them stop, as if something in the cabin's quiet was a thing they could not quite understand, and then, slowly, turn around and go back into the trees. I did not fire. I did not move for a long time after they were gone. I thought about what my uncle had put into his journal about smell, about how the cabin, with its cedar and its ash and its cold metal pump, had been chosen in part for a kind of olfactory quietness, how he believed that predators found people by scent as much as by sound. I did not know if my uncle had been right about that particular thing, but the 3 had turned around, and I had not fired, and that had been enough. The second time was in September. It was a single one, a boy, maybe 16. I saw him from the cabin window. He came into the clearing, and he stood in the middle of it, and he turned in a slow circle, and then he sat down in the grass. He sat there for a long time. He did not move. I watched him for an hour. In the end, I went out onto the porch with the rifle, and I said, loud enough to carry, "Son, you in there somewhere?" He did not answer. He did not look up. After another hour, he got up and he walked back into the trees. I went out with the rifle to the spot where he had been sitting. The grass was flat. There was a piece of yellow string tied around his wrist. I had seen it when he got up to leave. He had tied it there himself, maybe, once, when he was still himself. I did not follow him. I did not shoot him. I went back to the porch and I sat with my rifle across my knees and I watched the tree line until it got dark. The weather turned cold in October. By November, I had a foot of snow. I had moved mostly underground by then, running the little cast-iron stove in the shelter and venting the smoke up through the chimney as my uncle had designed. I read my way through his paperbacks. I read Gibbon. I wrote in the back pages of his journal. I wrote down, among other things, a full account of what had happened at Torrent Lake, as best I could remember it, because I had begun to understand that if I did not write it down, I would lose it, the way you lose a dream in the morning, and it seemed important that I not lose it. In December, a man came up the 2-track on foot. I saw him coming. I watched him from the porch with the rifle. He was alone. He was walking the way a living man walks, quick and cautious, and he was carrying an old military-issue pack and a lever-action rifle slung across his back. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, and he held up both hands, slowly, one still holding his rifle by the stock, and he called out, "Hey there! You friendly?" I said, "Who are you?" He said, "My name is Lars Ostman. I am from Hancock. I am walking south. I heard there is a settlement at Camp Grayling. I am trying to get there. I saw your chimney smoke. I thought I would ask if you had any news." His voice was a human voice. His eyes, even at that distance, were a human's eyes. I kept the rifle up for a long minute, because a long minute is what it takes to be sure, and then I lowered it, and I said, "Come have some coffee." Lars Ostman stayed with me for 3 days. He was a 40-something former iron mine foreman from Hancock who had lost his wife and his son in the first week of the outbreak and had been walking since October. He had slept in barns and under overpasses and in one fire lookout near the porcupines. He had seen some of what I had seen. He had seen other things I had not seen. He told me about a community that had formed at an old CCC camp near Watersmeet. He told me about a Mennonite settlement in Wisconsin that was taking in anyone who could work. He told me that he did not know if the settlement at Camp Grayling still existed, but that it was the only rumor he had left to chase. On the morning of the 4th day, he packed his pack and he said, "You could come with me." I said, "I could." He said, "But you are not going to." I said, "No." He said, "Why?" I sat on the porch rail for a minute. I did not know exactly how to say it. I finally said, "My uncle built this place for me. I don't know that yet for a fact, but I think he did. He built it knowing he might not live to use it. He built it thinking of whoever might need it later. I think I have to stay in it for a while longer because I have not yet been a worthy occupant of it. That is the best I can say it." Lars looked at me for a long time. He said, "Your uncle was lucky in his nephew." I said, "He was not, but I am trying." He shouldered his pack. He said, "If you change your mind, there is a route I am going to leave you on the kitchen table. Follow it south. If Grayling is still there, ask for Ostman. I will vouch for you." He left. I watched him go up the 2-track until the trees took him. I went inside. The route was on the kitchen table, drawn in his careful engineer's hand on the back of an envelope. I put it in my uncle's journal. I stayed at the cabin for 7 more years. I am going to tell you the truth now, which is the reason, I think, I have been telling you any of this. I stayed at that cabin for 7 more years because I was afraid. I was afraid of what I would find if I went south. I was afraid that I would find, somewhere between the cabin and Grayling, another Waldo Prue. I was afraid that I would find, at the end of it, a community of decent people who would ask me, in some quiet voice. And where were you when your base went down? And I would not know how to answer them in a way that was true and also let me sleep. I stayed because the cabin was a place my uncle had loved me enough to prepare for me, and because the shelter was a place I had not earned, and because I believed, for a long time, that I had to earn it before I could leave it. I believe now that I had it backwards. I believe now that the shelter was a kindness, and that a kindness is not a thing you earn, but a thing you carry forward. I believe my uncle understood that. I believe Waldo Prue understood it in the last hour of his life, which is why he did what he did, and which is why he made me promise the one thing he made me promise, which was that I would tell his mother, and which I eventually did in the spring of 1978, when I walked out of the cabin for the last time with my uncle's journal in my pack and his bolt-action .30-30 across my shoulder, and a dim idea of where Painsdale was. Waldo's mother was alive. She was living in a small cooperative in an old parochial school in Houghton. She had lost 3 of her 4 sons. She wept when I told her. She wept harder when I put the St. Christopher medal in her hand. She made me stay for a week. She fed me better than I had eaten in 7 years. On the night before I left, she sat across from me at the kitchen table of the cooperative, and she said, "Tony, what do you want to do now?" I said, "I want to be useful. I don't know how." She said, "Then go find out." I went and found out. I am a different man than I was at Torrent Lake. I live in a settlement near what used to be Escanaba. I have not carried a rifle for its original purpose in 4 years. I work with a team that keeps a small boat route open between the settlements on Green Bay and the Door Peninsula, because a boat route is a thing that requires only weather and attention, not government. I am a good boatman. I am, it turns out, a patient man, which surprises me more than anyone else, because I was not a patient boy. I have told almost no one what happened at Torrent Lake. I have told you because I have begun to understand that my silence is not a virtue. I kept it for a long time out of shame, and shame is a thing that serves only itself. Silence, when it protects you, is a kind of basement you have built yourself under your own life, and after a while, a basement is a place you cannot climb out of. I did not see Tesla Kostovsky fall. I did not see Staff Sergeant Dumfries die. I did not see Captain Niedermeyer, or Lieutenant Albrecht, or Airman Horner, or any of the others go under. I do not know what became of Paquette in his little room at the back of the maintenance building, whether he opened the door in the morning or whether he did not. I know only that I saw a tremor in Tesla's hand on a Tuesday, and I did not report it, and that on the following Sunday I drove a deuce and a half through a gate I had cut the chain on, and I did not close it behind me. Systems, it turns out, fail faster than the men inside them believe they will. Our training prepared us for a slow escalation. We drilled on the assumption that the chain of command would hold until the last moment, and that the last moment would give us time. What happened at Torrent Lake was not a slow escalation. What happened was a room of ordinary men being asked, very suddenly, to become something they had not rehearsed, and most of them trying, and most of them failing, not because they were bad men, but because the moment arrived without a briefing. Loyalty, I have come to think, is not what they taught us either. They taught us that loyalty was owed up the chain, to the officers above us, and through them to the flag and the country. But the loyalty that kept me alive was not loyalty to the chain. It was Dumfries putting his hand on my shoulder and telling me to check the fuel on a truck. It was Waldo Prue walking to a lake. It was my uncle Orrin Haugen, 4 summers of concrete work 40 years before I needed it, leaving a hatch I could open with my grandmother's birthday. Loyalty is what survives when the chain does not. It is the hand on the shoulder. It is the walk to the water. It is the key under the flat stone. Everything else is just the shape an institution takes until it forgets what it was for. I am 54 years old, writing this by the light of a kerosene lamp in a room that smells of cedar and cold ash. The lamp is my uncle's lamp. The cabin has a new family in it now, a young couple from Marinette who came up the route Lars Ostman drew for me on the back of an envelope, and who are raising 2 children there, and who write me once a year to tell me how the pump is holding up. They do not know, as far as I am aware, about the shelter underneath the woodshed. I have left that for them to find on their own, or not, as they choose. Some things are best discovered rather than given. I walked out of the cabin for the last time on the 8th of April, 1978. I did not close the door behind me. I did not need to. The next person who came up the 2-track would open it. That, I have finally learned, is how it works. That is how it has always worked. We leave the door for the next one. That is all we can do. That is all we are asked to do. And if you are reading this, somewhere, sometime, it is because I was right, and I did not want to be.